Hello, everyone. So today we're looking at Jane Austen's Love and Friendship, which is a short, chaotic, and very funny piece of juvenilia. It's a novella she wrote when she was 14. It's a parody of sentimental fiction, the kind of exaggerated emotional storytelling that was popular in late 18th century. So we will explore how Austen used certain techniques like irony, narrative voice, and social observation, social awareness, to kind of poke fun and subvert the culture of sensibility. Okay, so as I have said, Austen wrote this when she was just a teenager, long before Pride and Prejudice or Emma. What's striking is how fully formed her judgment feels, right? I mean, it does really feel like a fully deliberate work. So even at 14, she's experimenting. We can see her experimenting with things like irony and voice, right, in society. So this we can say that this isn't immature Austen, right? She's just testing out the tools that she will later, turn into her what came to be known as her signature style and manner of writing fiction. Okay, so let's make an attempt at definitions. So this is a short epistolary novella, which means this is basically a story told through letters. But instead of using the form for emotional intimacy, right, getting close to the reader or the correspondent, Austen here uses it to exaggerate everything, right? Hyperbole all the way. So what we have is sudden romances, faint and fits, dramatic reversals, and a pile of coincidences. So essentially, she's making a parody, an attempt at parodying the sentimental novels that equated or tried to equate intense emotion or affect with morality. Okay, so to understand what Austen is trying to do here, we need to understand this conception of sensibility. So in the late 18th century, sensibility was not just a literary trend, it was actually a cultural ideal. Built around this belief that deep feeling, sentiment, emotion is a very good marker for morality or moral excellence, right? So Austen in this novella is trying to push back against this idea, right? She's showing us how sensibility can become very farcical and theatrical and almost self-indulgent, right? Add to that the social disruption that happens as a result of believing in this idea of sensibility, right? So we can say that her satire is both literary and cultural at the same time. So the entire story kind of unfolds through this correspondence, which really gives Austen this sense of control over two things, right? Subjective voice and unreliability. So Laura, the narrator, is constantly, and this is very palpable, right? We can feel this. She's constantly performing this idea of sensibility, right? And because we only hear her side of the events, this humor kind of it feels manufactured, right, in a sense, but also we can also feel this gap coming out between the what actually happened and the narration itself, right? And so this is really important, and I think we should consider this carefully when reading this novella, right? This gap and what happens and how Austen uses this this feeling or this sense of the unreliable to kind of critique this culture of sensibility. And so the plot is intentionally ridiculous. We can agree on that, right? Laura meets Edward, they fall in love instantly, and then elope within minutes. From there, what we have is just this cascade of melodramatic events. We have constant fainting, homelessness, sudden death, and improbable reunions. So the point here isn't the plot itself. It really isn't the sequence of events. It's the way Austen exaggerates these sentimental tropes until they kind of collapse under their own weight, right? Because they inherently lack any meaning, any sense of direction or logic. So the method she uses essentially is that of deconstruction, using the trope of sentimentality as a guide in life to deconstruct it, right, through this story. Okay, so the narrator is Laura, right? She's self-absorbed. We can feel that, and she's overly dramatic, and of course, she's completely unreliable. Edward, the sentimental hero who mistakes impulse for virtue, right? And concern, parental concern for possibly parental tyranny. We have Sophie, Laura's friend and fainting friend, let's say, and the framing correspondents, Isabel and Marianne. These two show us how, this idea of sensibility can get, passed down and imitated in this kind of generational linear manner. The characters do feel like caricatures, but this is intentional, right? The humor and the caricaturish nature of the characters is very intentional, and this is kind of very obvious. Okay, so this we can say that the satire works through hyperbole and exaggeration. Sophie, faints constantly. Laura keeps running mad, right? They both make terrible decisions while insisting that they're kind of morally superior. So the tone itself is mock heroic. Like we have very trivial events sometimes happen, and they are described in this very exaggerated form, as if they were kind of epic tragedies. So Austen, the author, is manufacturing all of this, right? But she never really steps in to correct the protagonists, and so we are left to feel the absurdity, right, through their actions, and through the voice of Laura in the correspondence. So in this novella, we are essentially seeing early themes that Austen will later develop in life. So we have, for example, we have the tension between sense and sensibility, the idea that feeling without rational thought and judgment is dangerous. We have the idea of the performance of emotion, right? Sensibility can actually become a social script, some kind of a social trap. And then we have the idea of the limits of female agency at the time, which is kind of obvious, right, and kind of historically evident. And then we have the idea of narrative reliability, how the narrative voice can actually shape and manufacture interpretation, right? We feel like we're not really free to develop an interpretation that actually espouses this trend of sensibility over rational thought and judgment. Okay, so now let's look at how Austen deconstructs this idea of sensibility in more detail. Now here's a good example. Run mad as often as you choose, but do not faint. This is Sophie's advice to Laura, right? And this is one of the sharpest moments of irony in the entire novella. And it becomes even funnier when we place it in the context of 18th century conduct literature, right? So conduct books at the time were obsessed with regulating women's behavior, right? How they should speak, dress, walk, feel, and especially how they should manage their feelings. So these manuals, right, constantly warned young women against excessive passion and dramatic displays, or anything that might, suggest a lack of self-control. So Austen here, what she's doing is she's flipping that entire moral framework on its head, right? So Sophie's advice tells us that, well, running mad, the very definition of excess, is perfectly acceptable, while fainting is the real moral and behavioral failure. So this is a parody of the rigid and contradictory expectations that were, placed on women at the time. So conduct books essentially demanded that women both be delicate and rational, expressive yet controlled, sensitive but never inconvenient. So Austen here exposes how impossible and absurd those standards are. So this line works as a miniature satire of the whole culture of sensibility, right? So it mocks it kind of subverts the idea that virtue can be measured by emotional performance, and it shows how the rules of conduct literature collapse into nonsense when taken to their logical extreme. So Austen is effectively telling us here, if the culture insists on policing women's feelings and emotional displays, then the rules themselves deserve to be ridiculed and laughed at. Okay, so this is the thematic line I have mentioned earlier, right? And which functions as a thesis statement almost, right? And you can find this on page 319, right? And this is a perfect example of how Austen uses narrative control to position the reader against the narrator, right? Because Laura here is framing herself, right? Framing this idea of sensibility as this charming flaw, right? As some kind of a charming flaw. But the phrasing here is so exaggerated, right? And it's almost self-congratulatory in a way. And we can immediately, by the way, recognize this gap between how she sees herself and how we are meant to see her in a way. So Austen relies on this gap, and she uses this gap because the story is told from the perspective of Laura, right? We are trapped inside this kind of the self myth that she has, right? But instead of trusting her narration, right, we should learn to read past her and to notice the melodramatic events, the contradictions, and the self-interest that she can't herself perceive. So this is Austen training the reader, right, training us to become critics of sensibility, right, not consumers of it. So the line isn't just character description or like a thematic announcement, right? It's Austen using the protagonist's own narration to expose the absurdity of her perspective, right? Which, in turn guides us to recognize this satire, even though the Laura, remains oblivious to it for the most part. Okay, so this is a great example of the kind of social awareness that Austen developed at the age of 14. Here we have Edward, right, proudly declaring that defying his father is a great achievement, as if disobedience was some kind of some kind of moral heroism, right, and virtue. So what Austen is seeing here and mocking, right, is a cultural pattern in late 18th century sentimental fiction. And this pattern goes something like this. Young men confusing impulsiveness with virtue and rebellion with depth of feeling, right, and emotion. So in conduct literature, filial obedience was a cornerstone of social order, social structure. Yet sentimental heroes, like Edward here, right, they often dramatize their defiance as a proof of authenticity, individualism, right, which is a hallmark of romanticism, and emotional purity. So Austen is exposing something here, exposing how absurd that contradiction is. So Edward isn't resisting tyranny, right? We have no proof of his father being tyrannical, right? On the contrary, in the end, he actually offers Laura some money, right? So what Edward is doing here, he's not resisting tyranny. He's actually performing sensibility. So his rebellion is theatrical, self-centered, and socially disruptive. And Austen is inviting the reader to see how hollow this performance really is. So the humor, we can say, isn't just character-based. It's social commentary, essentially. So Austen is diagnosing a cultural script in which emotion becomes an excuse for irresponsibility. So, and she's using Edward here, right, to show how ridiculous this social script can actually be. Okay, so now let's conclude by making connections between what we have discussed so far. Love and Friendship, this novella isn't immature Austen. It's Austen experimenting in a very bold manner with the tools that she will later refine, right, in her major novels. So the satire isn't accidental or playful fluff. It's already central to her literary character, which she is developing. So this text also trains us, as readers, to pay attention to tone, irony, and narrative performance. So Austen uses Laura's voice not to express sincerity or authenticity, but to expose the gap between what a character believes and what the reader actually can see. So that's a skill students can carry into any literary analysis, right? The discrepancy between the character's self-perception and the reality of who they are. So finally, we have the idea of sensibility. Here is both cultural and also a literary target. So Austen is observing, critiquing, and exaggerating the emotional scripts of her time, right? She's showing us how a whole perspective, a whole worldview, one that equates feeling with virtue, can become absurd when pushed to its limits. So the takeaway is very simple, right? This novella may be short and chaotic, but it's doing a very sophisticated thing here. It's Austen learning how to wield the satire as a critical instrument, and it invites us to read with the same sharpness, right? With the same level of deconstruction. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with this reminder for this week's homework. We would like you to choose a single sentence or a short passage from the novella, a passage that really caught your attention. You should start by quoting the line and then give us 2 to 3 reasons and sentences explaining why it stood out to you, right? You can focus on the imagery, the tone, the irony, the style, or anything else that struck you as interesting. So this is due on Sunday. Take your time with it. Let your curiosity guide you. And yes, that's everything for today. Have a good rest of your week, and I will see you next time.